welcome, and it is great to see so many people here. For those of you tuning in via Zoom, today is the first time since the spring of 2020 where we've been able to come together and have actually food at one of our seminars. So this is really a wonderful moment. I just take a time to celebrate how far we've come, and I really want to thank everybody who's here, who's tuning in, for all the sacrifices you've made over the past 2 years. It's been really astounding how we've come together as a community. We've suffered great loss, but I think it's wonderful that we were able to pull together. So, having said that, today I have the pleasure of introducing Allison Carruth. Professor Allison Carruth is a professor in the High Meadows Environmental Institute and also in the Effron Center for the Study of America. Allison came in 2021. 2021, I think. Yeah, it's all the same year. CF, the previous discussion, right? This it has been really exciting to come little by little, first virtually and now in person, get to meet Allison. Allison is, while at UCLA, where she came from, to us, although that's not where she came from ultimately, was a founding director for the Laboratory in Environmental Narrative Strategies. At Princeton, she has started the Environmental Media Lab, which is sort of an exciting new area to bringing together a number of areas in the environment, and in particular helping us grow the environmental humanities. And Allison has a number of accomplishments over her career so far, and many to come, I am sure. But I think one of the best things that I've found about Allison is first off, she's on it, right? So whenever we're having a discussion, we get right to the point, and it's great. And part of that is, up to now, all the other speakers have left it to me to figure out their biography, which is a bad thing to do. And Allison actually handed me hers, and that was, thank you so much. All right, so with that, well, welcome, Allison.
Thank you to Gabe for inviting me to give this HMEI faculty seminar, to Raj, to Morgan, to Kathy, to the entire HMEI staff that really are a just dynamo team to work with. And to all of you who came today or are gathered online, I'm grateful. So I'll get right down to it. I want to begin with a thought experiment. Imagine you're directing a film about climate change that Netflix has optioned. You're around a table with the writing team debating the opening shot. The team had pitched a new take on a well-tested narrative. The science is clear, you told the studio executives. Climate change is upending Earth systems, and time is running out to forestall what writer and activist Bill McKibben calls life on a tough new planet. The story would be an apocalyptic one, shored up by facts. The data of scientists interknit with scenes of widespread ecological and social disaster. But it would eschew nihilism, ending with a vision of how the planet could be brought back from the brink with the efforts of heroic actors. And as for that opening shot, the team is weighing one of two tacks. Do you invoke the imagined audience's ideas of wilderness and pristine nature by panning over a remote landscape filmed without people, the Greenland ice sheet, a stretch of still forested Amazonian jungle? Or do you immerse viewers in the thick of climate crisis through a fast-moving montage of hurricanes and wildfires, oil fields and clogged freeways? This is the narrative template of planetary climate crisis. It has profoundly shaped the public life of climate change, perhaps above all in the American environmental imagination. It is the template that studios, streaming platforms, publishers, and news outlets have invested in and promoted, and it arguably is the template that has garnered the broadest audiences so far. It's a story encapsulated in the trailer for Netflix's latest climate docu-thriller, Breaking Boundaries: The Science of Our Planet.
The science is clear and has been communicated for the past 30 years, and still we're not moving in the right direction. I don't get depressed, I get angry. What are the systems that determine the state of the planet? This is about us. It is about our future.
All is not well with our planet. As we increase our pressures on Earth, we are now crossing irreversible tipping points.
Nature is being degraded at a rate and a scale that is unprecedented.
When we emit CO2, about a third has ended up in the ocean.
There's no sign of any wildlife at all.
Based on the 7.5 million deaths, we have already crossed the boundary as far as aerosols are concerned.
As we manipulate the planet's climate, we're literally playing with fire.
Are we concerned about fighting the climate crisis? The window is still open for us to have a future for humanity. We still have a chance. What we do between 20...
For whom are such stories meaningful? And for whom do they fall flat? What ways of knowing, experiencing, and redressing climate change do they privilege or conversely exclude? These are the questions behind a project I'm getting underway as a book-length study and as a series of collaborative story experiments in the Environmental Media Lab. Building on work in the environmental humanities, my initial premise here is that scientific knowledge and apocalyptic dread have been tightly coupled in the most prominent stories of climate change. Put differently, research-based science and world-ending soothsaying have become entwined in how climate change has been narrated, or what I term storied. Nor is this narrative template found just in movies and novels. It pervades a wide range of cultural forms, from professional science journalism to the social media of activist groups. I want to acknowledge at the outset that many of us here, myself very much included, may ourselves feel invested in the kinds of climate storytelling I'm outlining. These kinds of stories are arguably compelling for many audiences, and they have afforded an influential vehicle for communicating climate research and sparking certain types of climate action. We can see evidence of this impact. To this point, the Pew Research Center stunned pundits in 2020 when their annual poll of national policy priorities showed for the first time that a majority of respondents ranked climate change as the United States' most important political issue. Those findings were corroborated by Yale and George Mason's Global Warming's 6 Americas. Also in 2020, that annual study, which has only been going on for 5 years, reported that the group identified as alarmed, characterized as convinced global warming is happening, human-caused, and an urgent threat, now outstrips by a ratio of 3 to 1 those who dismiss climate change as neither human-caused nor really a problem at all. Following research in cognitive narrative theory and climate communication studies, I hazard that stories, melding data with disaster, have played no small part in thus moving the needle to make climate change a matter of fact and a burning issue for many. The ubiquitous phrase, "the science is clear," is a rhetorical shorthand for this way of knowing climate change. It's a phrase I've been identifying across diverse contexts and networks, from the Union of Concerned Scientists to Extinction Rebellion. This reference to scientific consensus goes hand in hand, moreover, with calls to action that also warn of the narrowing window to forestall worst-case scenarios. Time is running out. This narrative template of planetary climate crisis is part of a culture we could imperfectly call mainstream. But there are other cultures of climate change in which this narrative has not been meaningful or has been outright rejected. In How Climate Change Comes to Matter, Candice Callison shows that whether and how different groups become, quote, engaged with climate change is determined not just by access to information, but by how it becomes meaningful, by the forms of life climate change assumes. end quote. Her ethnographic study is calling into question the public understanding of science model within the field of communication, which foregrounds gaps between professional experts and general publics. This model has been central to empirical research designed to test whether specific messages, media interventions, and more recently, disinformation inoculations measurably and lastingly change a population's attitudes and beliefs about the science of an issue, in this case, climate change. For someone like Callison, this methodology privileges scientific authorities over other kinds of expertise and knowledge, with which I agree. Mike Halm puts a fine point on why climate change comes to matter so differently for different people. He defines climate change as exemplary of wicked problems, problems that develop from, but also come to symbolize yet other interrelated problems. Global pandemics may be similar in this regard. To take this really seriously, ask climate researchers, and especially climate communication researchers, to attend to conflicting framings of climate change that respond to separate, quote, problem elements and appeal to plural, even contradictory values, end quote. But another facet of the cultural complexity of climate change is this. Its legibility as a wicked problem has evolved in the digital age. That history leads to what Heather Hauser has termed infowhelm, defined as the enormity of data that now circulates alongside data's contestations and controversies. Hauser identifies climate change as particularly prone to infowhelm. She writes, myriad streams of information types, scientific, demographic, experiential, economic, cultural, gush out from this tentacular, ongoing crisis. One facet of the digital life of climate change is disinformation and the virality of that disinformation. A case in point, as many of you here know, since August, the IPCC has been releasing the 3 installments of its 6 assessment report on respectively the physical science, impacts, and mitigations of climate change. The second of these made headlines in February. The Guardian told the story this way: human actions are causing dangerous disruptions, and the window to secure a livable future is closing. Times India framed it as a confirmation of calls for climate justice and equity in countries' emissions reduction targets. The Economist led with the data point that over 3 billion people face growing climate threats while making the case for geoengineering. Meanwhile, over at Fox News, a short piece appeared on the website provocatively titled, "Scientists Challenge Alarm Bells in Climate Change Report. Not the End of the World." These 4 stories illustrate the multiple cultures of climate change. Even for those in which the scientific consensus and social urgency is taken for granted, climate change nonetheless illuminates different realities, different values, from the political power of the fossil fuel industry, to the colonial roots and legacies of industrial capitalism, to market-based innovation and technological progress. My outlier here of Fox News, by comparison, draws attention to how the structure of scientific research and the discourse of planetary catastrophe together get caricatured to make climate denialism meaningful to groups who are invested in or nostalgic for what indigenous environmental philosopher Kyle White terms the taken for granted state of affairs. So, addressing the wicked problem of climate storytelling, my project aims to understand both the strengths and limitations of the most predominant climate narratives while investigating how and why climate change is otherwise storied. So, having distilled the scopes and stakes of this work in progress, I want to turn to first a genre of climate crisis narrative that has very deep roots in white American environmental thought. And I'll say at the outset, this is a genre of climate and environmental narrative that has had an influence on me for a long time. In 1989, Bill McKibben published one of the first books about global warming for a broad audience, The End of Nature. Its ostensible aim was to convey scientific understanding of how fossil fuel-based societies had changed the atmosphere and in turn will change the weather, as he wrote. But this book was also a work of mourning for an idea of nature as a separate and wild province, an idea that anthropogenic climate change threatened with extinction for McKibben. This is a narrative that is at once apocalyptic. The earth as it has been known is passing away, and elegiac. The loss of nature's meaning for the writer is an object of grief. That grief is no doubt affectively and narratively powerful. And in this, The End of Nature reflects a long-standing tradition of environmental storytelling that laments industrialism and modernity as threats to pristine nature, what Ursula Heise calls a declensionist narrative of nature and its wildness. But there's a profound paradox in climate crisis narratives like McKibben's that build on this tradition in coupling scientific fact with end of nature grief. These narratives make the moral case for climate action at every scale, while intimating that such action may be too little, too late. By way of comparison, consider a much more recent narrative template in which climate change shapeshifts from an existential threat to a surprising opportunity. About one thing, McKibben and a group of scientists, engineers, and writers who embrace rather than lament the end of nature agree. The planet today is nowhere unaltered by people. The Holocene gives way to the Anthropocene. This observation opens onto my forthcoming book novel, Ecologies, which argues that a new environmental imagination has developed out of confrontations and convergences among engineering, ecology, and environmentalism in contemporary American culture, particularly on the West Coast. I think about this imaginary in the language of art adaptation as nature remade, in the language of software as nature rebooted. This narrative of nature remade dispenses with eco-apocalypse altogether in favor of technological optimism. Science writer Emma Marris tells the story this way. The recognition of climate change galvanizes a heretofore unthinkable, exciting, energizing thought. We can make more nature. The scientists, technologists, investors, and professional storytellers like Marris who advocate this nature making in response to climate change thus offer a fairly charismatic alternative to the end of nature story. Centered on the West Coast, as I've suggested, the narrative crux of Nature Remade is the idea that the climate changed world will lead to innovation that assures brighter futures ahead. In his much-cited book, The Great Derangement, the novelist Amitav Ghosh pinpoints a fundamental challenge of narrating climate change in any context, for any storyteller, professional or otherwise. While climate change appears at first glance improbable, even surreal and fantastical, its causes and consequences are overwhelmingly, urgently, astoundingly real. The challenge climate change thus poses to storytellers, Ghosh says, is how to imagine the unimaginable. That challenge has been answered in one way by the stories I invoked at the outset, from global warming documentaries to futuristic climate dystopias, in yet another way by environmentalist end of nature narratives like McKibben's, and in yet another way by this emergent story of Nature Remade. But how is climate change known and narrated outside these various mainstreams of mass media, environmental activism, and what I'll just call tech? How more pointedly does climate change and its possible futures coalesce as it is lived with? These questions will be central to the second phase of my research for the Sciences Clear. They are also central to the work of the Environmental Art and Media Lab. I'll close then by sketching an initial proof of concept for the lab, which will also serve to test more robustly these ideas I'm sharing today about the storing of climate change. So the Environmental Art and Media Lab, or Environmental Media Lab for short sometimes, is designed to be a collaborative and transdisciplinary hub for research on and experimentation with different forms of imagining wicked problems, including climate change, and some of the group are here today. The lab's animating hypothesis is that many different narratives are vital to convey both research about and lived realities of these problems, and articulate possibilities for livable futures beyond extractive capitalism and climate disaster. Central to this work is an annual climate story incubator. The first such incubator is designed to create and then reflexively study narratives about highly localized experiences of climate disruption and climate action on the Mid-Atlantic and Pacific coastlines of the US. This effort is getting underway with a student-led story series this summer, part of the HMEI internship program, about Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Ida, 2012 and 2021. This series will center on several locales in the Mid-Atlantic, from South Cape May to Rockaway, Queens, and the people who have led efforts to document, recover from, and organize in response to their experiences, very much including people we might identify as climate skeptics or climate denialists. Key to this project is a site-specific and participatory exploration of the many cultures, but also the many epistemologies by which environments and environmental crises come to matter. A year from now, I hope to share the results, findings, and no doubt challenges of this work. For today's purposes, I'll share another climate story, one that I'm thinking of as a model for the lab and its Coastal Futures Incubator. Directed and produced by a geographer turned experimental documentarian, The Hottest August is a story of climate change that is not really explicitly about climate change. Has anyone seen it? Out of curiosity. So, not yet a blockbuster. Which is actually one of the things I'm interested in this work. Back to the film. It tells this story of climate change by way of the daily lives of people across New York City during what was at the time the hottest August on record, August of 2017. Interspersed with interviews is the voice of a narrator who meditates on extinction, sea level rise, and the weird new normal of climate change by quoting, while never actually citing, contemporary writers and historical thinkers, from the novelist Zadie Smith to Karl Marx, who likely needs little introduction. The third and final of these voiceovers is drawn from Annie Dillard's 2014 story, Total Eclipse. And I quote, "That August would turn out to be many things, but not the hottest, not even close. There would be more rain than sun, more fog than light, more habits than dreams. Elsewhere that month, and in the many months after, hurricanes surged and fires burned, while around New York, the water simply rose and rose." A sort of climate surrealism, to call back to Amitav Ghosh, thus mixes here with very banal, ordinary daily life across New York's 5 boroughs, with the everyday lives, in particular, of white union construction workers, college students, 311 call center dispatchers, Black Lives Matter activists, beachgoers, Great Gatsby recreators, and jazz lovers, along with an investor, a VR creator, an American Littoral Society conservation scientist, a Zumba teacher, a mechanic, and an Afrofuturist performance artist. So, as a counterpoint to the climate crisis story with which I began, imagining us around the table in a Netflix writing room, please consider this story's trailer.
From all the hills came screams. A piece of sky beside the crescent sun was detaching. It was the monstrous swift shadow cone of the moon, hauling darkness like plague behind it.
Do you have any worries about the future?
What future?
I'm greatly concerned about the planet, which is falling apart. Even before tragedy happened in my own life, I had made that choice to just be ready and prepared for things.
I grew up here, my mother grew up here. Nothing ever happened like this.
It's a shame. It's a shame.
No.
No. No.
This is a modern time filled with a lot of stress.
People have thought the United States is far more stable than it actually is. We've had this uneasy truth, this fake stability for a long period of time.
I believe your quality of life is better if you have a lot of money.
We're very resourceful. I'll worry about it when the time comes.
Hands up, go shoot, hands up, go shoot, hands up, go shoot, hands up, go shoot, hands up, go shoot.
So I'm going to close with a second thought experiment. With this story now in mind, let me return to that opening scene, gathered around the table in a writing room. But this time, I'll ask you to imagine scripting the opening shot of your climate story. How would you tell it if you couldn't rely on the data and you decided you weren't going to invoke catastrophe? What kind of story would you tell? Thank you. Raj, should I leave the lavalier mic on? Yes? Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Allison. And so we are now going to enter the Q&A part of the afternoon. And I have in front of me, for those of you tuning in remotely, I have a connection to the Q&A, so send the questions via the Q&A feature of Zoom. I will read them and relay them to Allison. And first, do we have any questions in the audience right now? Sophia, yeah. Why don't we wait till the microphone gets to you so that I don't have to repeat it.
Thanks for a really neat presentation. I'm curious if you would consider the asking and investigation of scientific questions as part of a storytelling process about climate change, or do you see science as a separate domain from which stories may or may not draw from?
That is such just a really thoughtful and complex question that I'm thinking about a lot in this project, along with many others I know, including some in this room and online, no doubt. So yeah, I follow others in feeling that there is too a culture of science, right? Cultures of science. This is something that comes out of history of science, the field called science and technology studies, anthropology of science, and many other realms, right? And within that broad understanding, right? That from the design of methodology, the asking of a question, right? We as scientists are invested too, right? This doesn't mean that there isn't rigor, that there isn't, right, the processes of peer review. But there are values, there are aspirations, right? There are commitments, and there are stories. And so I follow many other scholars, including for me, especially in the environmental humanities, to think about, so what are those relationships between the practices of science, the methods of science, the data of science, and its storying, right? And then how does the way that science stories itself, right, clash with, intersect with, benefit from storying that's outside, right, of the realm of science as we think about it, particularly in a place like this. Does that begin to? But I mean, let me just also follow up by saying for this project, I'm hoping that there will be oral histories with scientists who have worked with Netflix studios, right? National Geographic teams, science reporters, right? developing interactive data visualizations for the front page of the New York Times, right? How do they think about what's worked and what hasn't, right? Where they feel that the story has actually gotten it wrong, despite good intentions.
So there's another question up there.
Maybe to follow up on that, how wide do you spin your net? For example, do you look at why people choose the story that they choose to tell? Or do you look at the consequences of the stories that they tell?
Wow. That is another really good question. So the question here is, right, am I interested both in what motivates the storyteller, whoever they may be, and how it acts on the world, right, once it's let loose, if you will. It's funny because my original academic training is in literary studies, which is a field that for a long time felt that you couldn't, in fact, ask or answer the question about an artist or storyteller's intentions. Right? We can't know that. That's a black box. I completely disagree, along with many others. Storytellers love to talk about what they hope they'll do with their stories. Amitav Ghosh is an example of a novelist who writes abundantly in nonfiction to talk about his theory of narrative, right? And what it does in the world, where its limits are and blind spots. So in this project, I'm shifting a bit though, because I'm starting to instead be more interested in what are the afterlives of these stories, right? I'm interested, and in fact have reached out to the director of the Hottest August Brett story for an interview. I'm interested in what was she thinking? Her prior documentary was also experimental, but it was about incarceration, right? How did she get from there to here? And if you watch the film, you can see the threads. But I'm much more interested in why a documentary like that has a very small audience. What would it mean if it didn't? What might it do in the world if it didn't?
So I have a question, Reed, and then.
Hi, Allison. Thank you so much for a really terrific and inspiring presentation. So I was really struck by your kind of Nature Reimagined series of books and slides. And I'm wondering, the one that jumps to my mind, obviously being more water related, is the sort of the dystopian future in The Water Knife, right? So where nature is relegated into these...
Paolo Bacigalupi's novel, The Water Knife.
Yes, exactly, where these are just, nature is relegated only to artificial creations in these biomes where there's enough water to support them, and there's really just, barren wasteland outside. And so I'm curious if there's other examples of sort of the extreme, Nature Reimagined that you might touch on or might comment on.
I'm happy to. Can I just throw, and not to worry if nothing comes to mind, a question back to you? I mean, you run a groundwater modeling center. Why was that dystopian speculative novel, The Water Knife, interesting to you? Like, what did it illuminate or affirm?
You mean the future foretelling of
what's
going to happen? The actual portal into the future?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think because so much of the science is actually... So much of the science is actually really pretty accurate in that book, being something that works heavily on the Upper Colorado system, and it, there's already in crisis, and that obviously a lot of the the dystopian things take it one step farther, but the underpinning science is actually pretty well researched in that book, and a lot of the understanding of water rights, a lot of the understanding of how the system works, and the injustices that can arise from that, now 130-year-old structure, being the legal structure. I think it's a really interesting thing, and that's one of the reasons that it sort of resonates. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
nice job
that's
putting
really
me back on the spot.
No, that's actually really, really marvelous, because I think one of the things I would say is, and in fact, that's the work I presented that is, part of this project that's about to be done, Novel Ecology. So I've spent a lot of time with these technologically optimistic speculations, some of which are actual speculations in the sense of speculative finance and venture capital, right? On everything from something known as de-extinction, Pleistocene rewilding. I'm sure there's some conservationists and ecologists here who have things to say about that, and to space colonization. And I think what is vital and what this project Novel Ecology spends a lot of time looking at is actually pushing up against these technologically optimistic narratives about the future, other ways of anticipating, right? Where we could go. Not all of them necessarily dystopian, right? Some of them just more gritty and real, right? And so, for example, for this de-extinction part of Nature Remade, I look at the Chamorro poet Craig Santos Perez, who thinks a lot about biodiversity loss in Micronesia, and sort of strategies for both its recuperation that are also strategies of decolonial environmental justice, that for which captive breeding on the one hand and certainly synthetic biology on the other don't answer enough of those realities. So that's like a very different example from something like the water knife. And I think just with that, what I would say is I'm getting more interested in narratives that take us into the future that are not necessarily science fictional, right? Or that take us into futures that we don't even know if they are future, right? In fact, maybe they are parallel present. So maybe I'll end that there.
So there's another question here, and then after that there's a couple online. And then more in here. Okay, there's a number.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the talk. One of the things that I quite like about the way that you have set it up is you have this very compelling typology of how we might think about narratives of climate change, climate disaster. And on the one hand, there's a way that we can see a kind of axis between something that looks like despair and something that looks like inspiration.
Yeah.
And so you have this sort of the technological sublime, but also the incapacity for individual action to make any difference in the grand scheme of things. So that's sort of one axis. But then you have this other axis that you're working with that I find that axis very frustrating for various reasons. But one of the things you're also talking about is this axis between lots of data versus personal stories and connection. And so one of the difficulties, I think, with the scientific communication literature that it has identified for itself is that people who are convinced by lots of data are already convinced by lots of data.
Right.
And so we,
myself included,
I'm totally convinced by it, right? Like we have a tendency, therefore, to be continuously inspired by these repeated stories. And the example that you provided of the hottest August is very different. It's a story about regular people, where regular people can also find connections with the folks that they're seeing on the screen. Whether or not they agree with them, they at least seem like normal people in some fashion. And so I'm curious about how you see these two axes interacting, and whether or not the kinds of stories that connect at a personal level have to be inspirational, have to be hopeful, have to provide some access, some capacity for individual action, or whether there's sort of space in the middle. Like, how do these go together is my big question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, this first axis that you flagged as despair to inspiration, which is partly affective, right? But it also is aesthetic, right? I mean, one of the things that really strikes me about this latest Netflix documentary, and the film kind of is an expanded version of the trailer, is that it just mounts the scientific case for the end is nigh. But we have a last chance. Now, that story has been being told since the 1960s, arguably, right? And this is the decade. Okay, this is the decade. Okay, this is really the decade, right? And so there's like, as a viewer who's seen this story being told for a long time, you shuttle between watching this resignation, this despair, but why will 2020 to 2030 end differently than 2010 to 2020 did? And yet, there's a way the aesthetics of the narrative, including the uses of data visualization, as well as individual scientist interviews and their affect, their fire in the belly, that it stirs you up again, right? So this is just to say those two things, I think, coexist and kind of clash in the exact same stories of climate change. What I find really striking about something like the hottest August, as for now an outlier, if you will, right, is that it sort of gets around this problem of like big scale of geological time, of the data behind anthropogenic climate change and all of its facets, of the structural changes required, and the inertia, the geopolitical and economic inertia to realize them. And then this change a light bulb, which we joke about that at An Inconvenient Truth in 2006, but still lots and lots of these stories end with something along the lines of buy a electric car, because and it's understandable. I don't even discount this. I do these things myself. But what's fascinating about the hottest August is I think instead, it asks us to dwell in a much more uncomfortable place of an in-betweenness, in between despair and fire in the belly, nihilism and just righteous conviction or outrage, the idea that I can change this by changing what I do at home, or the idea that I can only change this at COP, at the conference and the parties, right? It actually, I think, also asks us to understand that someone who says, I'll worry about this when it's time, says that because there are lots of other things to worry about, and you see that in yourself, right? When you hear Black Lives Matter protesters, right, don't shoot, hands up, you realize there's another reality that's just as catastrophic, just as urgent. And so the dwelling in those middle spaces and those competing realities that are also overlapping, I think is somewhere we need to spend some time, actually. And this is where Kyle Powys-White, he's an indigenous Potawatomi environmental philosopher. Some of you may know his work, may know him. His work has had a huge influence on my work in general, but this latest paper that I was citing, Time as Kinship, just really stopped me in my tracks, for asking me to think about the taken for granted state of affairs that climate emergency, or my own sense of climate emergency, is invested in.
Okay, Allison, we have a question. We have a number of questions online. I don't know if we'll be able to get through all of them. For those of you that put in questions online, I've screenshotted them, and I will get them to Allison for those. Okay. So one of the questions is from Avni Vats. As we move towards more localized live accounts, how can we ensure that they're authentic and not tokenistic, particularly in the context of stories from underrepresented and empowered communities?
I think it's the question. I think it's the question that anyone doing something like I'm doing and directing this new lab should be grappling with. And I think part of that is not imagining that any one group or person will be the teller of all the stories or the best stories, first of all, but also to really think about the design of teams who are involved in climate and other environmental narrative and communication efforts or research or projects, right? To learn from the methods of participatory ethnography and social action research, right? To actually learn from other fields that have decades now of models and experience with research that extends beyond the walls of the academy and also has this kind of applied dimension. I think about this really as kind of applied research in the environmental arts and humanities, and I think it's really vital that there are lots of different people and communities who are in the mix of that, for sure.
So we have another question here from Colin Hickey. I'm wondering if Allison, that's you, can say something about what it might mean for a story to be quote unquote successful or to be quote unquote working. List a number of different measures, purposes, articulation of moral values, motivational purposes, etc. But the question was aiming and for if you had any sort of free-ranging thoughts on this issue.
Okay, so let me see, can I see this one more time? This is, okay, I'm wondering what it means for a story to be successful or working, this is also one of the questions I'm grappling with in this work, and so I gave one model of an answer that I clearly don't feel attached to, which is box office revenues, which, by the way, are becoming less and less relevant. If you look at a movie from 2020, the box office revenues are not going to tell you a lot about its reach or its impact. I also start in this work from the premise that reach is not the same as impact or as change, right? And you can't draw direct lines between the size of an audience for a story or a storytelling form and what it unleashes in the world. And there's a virality to disinformation, but there also is a really, to me, very fascinating and exciting virality to all kinds of information, including this special category we call story. So I think for this work, I'm particularly interested in two things in terms of Colin's question. First of all, how might bringing a larger and more varied set of stories to bigger audiences, how might it actually start to create more opportunities for solidarity building, for people seeing themselves in stories of climate change, which itself, I think, is a meaningful project. So one measure of sort of success or impact here is like, how can something like the Hottest August, right, find its way not to 1,000 people, right, but to 100,000 people, or at least across the 5 boroughs of New York, be seen. And then what other kinds of activities and sort of community building might go alongside that. And I'm thinking of my colleague in HMUI, Christina Gerhardt's work with the High Waterline Project, which I really encourage you to come to one of the 3 panels that she'll be leading around. This really, to me, really sort of exemplary case of climate change as it's being lived, climate change in the register of the everyday.
Okay, let me look. There's a question over here in the front that I skipped. I'm sorry.
You're okay.
No. You know what? It's fast. This is faster.
So my question, Allison, thank you for this talk, basically picks up on what you were just talking about in terms of reaching audience, because there's the storytellers, and then there's the people who listen to stories, and there's all the noise in the middle about the people who mediate the stories, the publishing houses, the studios, right?
Studio execs.
And there's a set of ideas about what the market can bear, what people are willing to listen to, and so I'm wondering about that piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. Such a good question, Tessa, thank you. I don't even know if I would have even the beginnings of an answer had I not spent a decade in Los Angeles, the largest media market, as it's called in the country, And during that time, as part of the Lab for Environmental Narrative Strategies I co-founded with colleagues and directed, we were involved in a multi-year storytelling project with KCET, which is the country's largest public media organization, with a television network and a whole digital platform. And the collaboration there was about the question of, well, what might happen if we brought seasoned documentary filmmakers and journalists and producers together with the kinds of specialized knowledge and training in fields like ecology, environmental humanities, and so on, right? And our effort, our kind of task was to tell a set of stories across different media in new and old ways that were really localized to Los Angeles, but also stories that this sort of team at KCET didn't have the bandwidth, didn't have the resources to tell. And it was an interesting and really kind of, it was an immersion, first of all, in a whole world I had never been directly a part of. And suddenly stories, co-authored and co-produced by PhD students were reaching 10,000 people instead of 15, right? One of the things that it made me really interested in is public media, right? Which has a very different, it has far more reach than most academic media, but a far different set of commercial considerations. At the same time, documentary, right, is over the last 10 to 15 years has just exploded, in no small part because of a streaming platform like Netflix, and now really all the streaming platforms are kind of part of that. And so your question, I think, makes me want to ask, how can that world be convinced that what has worked before doesn't have to be all that works for them, right? What would it look like to, have a kind of, right, conference or symposium that brings those studio executives, right, to hear something like this, to meet with storytellers like, the director of Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change, for example, and think about how a story like that could also appear, right, in the top 10 Netflix shows being watched today around the country. So Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much more to say there, but that's where I'd start.
Okay, we have another front-ish row question.
Michael, part of the Environmental Media Lab team.
Yes, I'm very excited to work this summer with you, Professor. So I wanted to ask, we talk about the value of hyperlocal stories.
Hyperlocal,
And
yeah.
I'm thinking of the spectrum of that. You can be hyperlocal in Rockaway, Queens.
Yes.
But you can also be hyperlocal in Arctic Alaska.
Yes, yeah.
So how do you compare the need to talk to individuals in a place like New York or Norfolk, Virginia, that then extends to entire cities, versus a place like the Yukon Delta where the communities are max 500 people,
right.
and considering all the communities, it's a maximum of 14,000 people.
Yeah.
How do you compare the needs for those kinds of hyperlocal stories?
I mean, right, so, right, hyperlocal means something very different, right, in the Inuit Arctic than it does in Rockaway, Queens, or Los Angeles. And I will start by saying that given that on my dad's side, right, my dad and his siblings and my grandparents lived in a town of just a few hundred people in Wyoming, and then I have spent a decade in Los Angeles. This is like something I have sort of visceral sense of, right? Even though those are very different communities than the ones that you're offering. I think the first thing I would say is what's common in the effort to do a kind of hyper-local, right, climate story is it gets out of this planet eye view. So you see, in Before the Flood, the film that Nat Geo produced and released, directed by Fisher Stevens, kind of starring, if you will, Leonardo DiCaprio when he was the UN Messenger of Peace for 2 years traveling the world. I would say a full 2/3 of the footage is shot from a helicopter, right? And DiCaprio, you know, and I do not question his commitments, right, as a high-profile celebrity to climate change and climate politics. And he gave a searing speech at the Paris talks that year. But that view, right, is a planet eye one. It's a jet-setting one, right? And so the first part of hyperlocal to me that is crucial and different is that it is at the ground level, right? It requires building relationships. It requires, if you're an outsider to that community, really taking time to build those relationships and trust, right? And to be observant to things that maybe have nothing to do with climate change on the surface, right? But might have a lot to say about how a community that is living climate change as we speak, right, is adapting, is mitigating, right, is redressing it in ways we might not otherwise notice from a helicopter. So that's how I'd start. We will be able to talk about this much more.
All right, so we're running close to time, and I'm going to take the prerogative to ask a final question.
Okay.
Because I've been really curious about this. I'm going to bother you about this after we leave again also. But in the hyperlocal story, is there not a tension with sort of the underlying scientific basis, right? When we take the global view, that is where our understanding is most strongly grounded, where we're most confident. When we get to the hyperlocal, there's a lot of things that may look like climate change that may not be climate change, and other things that may not look like climate change but are.
Yeah.
And so is there a tension there, or is that part of the flavor?
There is a tension there. Absolutely. I mean, I think about, on the one hand, a former colleague of mine at UCLA, Alex Hall, and others who are scaling down climate models to try to make, you know, relatively verifiable or at least instructive models at the neighborhood level, right? The block level. You know, I think about some of this that's happening in New York specifically after Sandy, and it started happening after Ida, about really trying to understand through the scaling down or differently scaling of climate science, what we can expect more of, less of. When is it a climate signal and when is it something else? So I think I think climate science is happening at that scale, and there is also a tension, to your point, since the 1960s. I mean, think about like the Mauna Loa summit, right, where the CO2 measurements have been taken in particular. So much has needed the planet eye view, right, to get where it's gone. So I think what I would say right now is I recognize that as a tension. Yeah, but I'm interested with where there's a kind of hyper-local climate science to be differently made visible, right, too, than the models that the New York Times most frequently publishes.
Okay, well, I would ask everybody to once again thank Allison. This is phenomenal.
Thank you. Thanks, Gabe.
And I would like to thank you all again for coming and for joining us online.
Thank you.